This. All right, so this lecture is on the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And this meets Content Standard 8 of the Ohio Social Studies Academic Content Standards for American History. By the end of the lecture, you should be able to identify ratification concerns, identify and compare arguments of both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, identify which view prevailed in the argument about ratification, and be able to explain why this view prevailed and have evidence to support it. So we're going to start with the Anti-Federalists. Anti means against. So the Anti-Federalists were against a strong federal government. They were against the ratification of the Constitution because the Constitution created that strong federal government. They wanted to keep the power in the hands of the people, in the hands of the states. They were happy with the Articles of Confederation and just kind of amending those articles to meet the needs that they needed, rather than scrap the whole articles and rewrite the Constitution and put in place the new U.S. Constitution. So they were against doing this. Some of the big leaders were Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason. Probably Patrick Henry, George Mason being more prominent than Jefferson, but nonetheless. The Anti-Federalists represented the common person during this time period, the average American citizen of the colonies. And most of the time, the average American citizens in this time were lower class, what we would consider to be lower class, making enough money just to survive for themselves and their family. This is mostly people that lived in rural areas, farmers, small farmers. So not having very large farms and very large plantations, but small farmers, and most of the time uneducated because there were no compulsory education laws at the time. Education was not required. So many people did not get a formal education unless they were privileged. The Anti-Federalists had several reasons that they were against the Constitution, but I'm going to talk about 5 major reasons. The first one and most prominent is that there was no Bill of Rights. So the Anti-Federalists were the group that were most jaded by the rule of King George III under the British and felt the most impact of the grievances that they had against the king. They were the ones that suffered the most, they felt, at the hands of the king. They were the ones that, when the tax hikes happened, they were the ones whose income was taken from them, and they were, having a hard time making ends meet. They were the ones who were forced to house the soldiers in their homes under the Quartering Acts. They were the ones that suffered the most. And so they really wanted to make sure that their rights as citizens, their natural rights, were being protected. The Anti-Federalists felt that their rights must be listed out in order to be guaranteed. If we did not list out our rights, then there would be no guarantee that our rights, our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of due process of law, so having a trial by jury and a fair trial and judge to hear our pleas, would be not guaranteed. So unless we had them written down and set in stone. The national government, they felt, was too powerful. We were giving too much power to the national government by creating this new system of federalism. Remember, federalism is a vocabulary word. This is balancing out the power between the state and the national government. So the Anti-Federalists were afraid of giving this balance of power and making the national government as powerful, or even more powerful a little bit, than the states. And this ties into the third clause, which is the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause said that the Constitution was supreme law of the land. So this allowed for the Constitution and the laws of the national government to trump the laws of the state governments. So, for example, if there was a law that made about religion and limiting free religion at the national level, and states had a law that said there was freedom of religion, the national law would win. So it would cancel out that state law of freedom of religion and make the national religion whatever religion they wanted. So again, the Constitution would be supreme. And so the Anti-Federalists didn't like this because they felt that the national government had way too much power over the states by having this clause, and that they would abuse the power and again be tyrannical and oppress the people and their rights. The Anti-Federalists in general just felt that the people would be better served under a smaller state government, and their needs as citizens would be met, and they would be heard. Their voice would be stronger if it was at the state level, and that they would be better served, and their needs, like I said, would be fulfilled. So then a large national government. They felt under a large national government, it wasn't possible for the large government to meet the needs of the constituents, the voters living in that state or that territory, that nation, and that the larger interest groups would kind of win out, and the rich would be heard and the poor people would not. So they feared, again, this powerful national government. And the last ties into this theme of the powerful national government that they feared, that a strong executive branch would be created, giving the president too much power to change and enforce the laws. They felt that the president would be like the king, again, going back to this abusive relationship under the Declaration of Independence with King George III, that the president would become a monarch and abuse his power and again oppress the people and take away their natural rights, violating that social contract, that agreement between the national government and its citizens to protect the rights of the people. On the flip side of the argument was the Federalists. The Federalists were in support of the Constitution. They felt that the Articles of Confederation was too big of a mess and it couldn't be fixed, and it was just easier to scrap the whole thing and start from scratch and rewrite the Constitution. So they were in support of a stronger federal government. They recognized the need for revamping the government in all aspects. They were usually tended to be more educated. They were the elite of the society in general. This was the middle upper class people, a lot of people living in the cities, urban dwellers, and again, had the privilege of being educated. A lot of them were leading politicians of the time period. And we had the main supporters, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and the father of the Constitution, James Madison. They wrote the Federalist Papers in order to gain support for their argument, but they really favored that stronger national government. And this kind of spun out of Shays' Rebellion and how we were unable to stop this farmers' rebellion. And it really just kind of exploited the weaknesses of the nation and the need for creating a stronger national government that can command an army and protect our nation from both inside and outside threats, and other powers as well, like power to tax and regulate trade and stop issues from happening in the first place, and put some regulations to create cohesiveness and unity within our nation. So for every argument that the Anti-Federalists had against the Constitution, the Federalists had for the Constitution. So we're just going to look at three of the major themes from the Federalists and reasons why they supported the Constitution. They believed that a strong government was needed to protect us from uprisings within our nation and from foreign invasion. So our government under the Articles could not raise an army, they could not command an army, they couldn't tax in order to provide for the needs of the military or for anything else in the public eye, which was all causing a lot of problems for our nation as a whole. So they believed that there had to be a balance of power, that we had to revamp our government and create a strong federal government that could protect us. They also disagreed with the Anti-Federalists, and they believed that a large government was necessary to serve the interests of the nation as a whole. So looking at what is best serving our nation as a general population, rather than looking at small umbrellas like under the state or under the city. They believe that the state and city governments could still fulfill the needs of the people living in the state or filling the needs of the people living in the city, but the national government's job was to serve the interests of the nation as a whole. So providing public services that everybody in the nation would benefit from, such as a strong military, such as now programs this didn't really relate to back then necessarily, but programs like that benefit everyone, like the welfare and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and education, funding for education and technology advancement and all of these things that later came, in our 20th and 21st century needs as we progress. But they knew that the country was going to grow and times would change and that the government needed to be able to protect and serve the people as a whole nation rather than small states. So the third power, or the third reason to support the Constitution, was that basically they were arguing against the argument that the government was too strong. They were arguing that the government was set up in such a way and structured in such a way under the Constitution that there were checks and balances put in place to make sure that the government did not become too powerful. So it's divided in several levels. We have division of the powers between the national and state governments and what each can do and which powers they share, which powers are reserved for the states, which ones are reserved for the national government, which ones can they both do. So that balances out the power there. And then within the national government itself, the power is divided and balanced between the three branches. So the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch was created to enforce those laws, and the judicial branch was created to judge the laws to make sure they're following the Constitution and not violating our natural rights. Okay, so for example, the legislative branch, Congress, can make a law to tax. Okay, so maybe they pass a law through that says they could tax 75% of your income. And the president can veto that law, thinking that it is unfair, and so he is essentially striking it down. He feels that the Congress is abusing their powers, and they can check them back into place. So the executive branch can go through and turn down a law. If the law makes it through and the people feel it's unfair, they can take it to court, and it can make its way up through the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can then hear the case and decide whether or not it's violating people's constitutional rights. I mean, this is very general and a very summary, summarizing the events that it would actually happen to take place to get to the Supreme Court, but you get the gist of things. So they believe that there's natural checks and balances put in place so that we can't have a tyrannical government, and that our leader, our president, cannot abuse his powers and oppress the people and violate and abuse the natural rights of the citizens because of the way the government is structured. The big thing here is the Bill of Rights, and that's what the Anti-Federalists were really pushing through for, and this was their argument against the Constitution. This was their major argument. Because the national government they felt was too strong, they really wanted to guarantee the rights of the citizens. The Federalists didn't think that the Bill of Rights was necessary because they felt that people's rights were inherent. We were born with them. It was a given that we all had these rights. And by writing these rights down and listing them, we were actually limiting ourselves to only the rights listed. Well, after some debate and going back and forth, eventually the Bill of Rights was passed. This was the major compromise of the two parties, or the two sides, essentially. So you have the Anti-Federalists, who aren't crazy about this new strong government, but they're going to concede if this Bill of Rights is added, and the Federalists who don't feel that it's necessary, but want to have everyone on board, want to pass this new Constitution. And so they conceded and compromised by adding the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. It was ratified, and the Bill of Rights was added and ratified shortly after, and all states eventually were on board. And here we are with the U.S. Constitution.